Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. I'm Papa Boris, and in this video, I'm going to start playing a new game of Pillars of Eternity. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, wow, Boris, way to live on the razor's edge. Wow, you haven't posted a single video to your channel in 4 months, and now you're going back and playing a game from 2015. Wow, how do you keep up with the times? And my response is, shut up, this game's really fun. I hadn't had a chance to play it for a long time, and I did, and I really enjoyed it, so I'm just going to play this because it's what I like to play, and I want to make a video on it. Now, this first video will be a bit of character creation, and if you don't care about any of that, you should definitely skip ahead to the next video where we actually start playing. I also want to give a few quick disclaimers. I'm not playing on the hardest difficulty. I'm playing on the second hardest, which I know makes me a pathetic loser and a miserable wretch who deserves to go to hell. So if that's a pain for you, then I totally respect that. But one thing I like about Pillars of Eternity is that it really lets you play the game how you want. There's a lot of different things you can do to kind of make the game work for you. It's a very flexible game. So for me, like, I hate scrolls, I hate potions, so I'm just not going to use them, and I'm not going to play on the hardest difficulty. I'm only going to play on the second hardest, and it works. It's like challenging enough that I'll probably lose sometimes and have to reload, challenging enough to be interesting, but not so hard as to be totally unreasonable. And I like that about this game. You can really customize your experience. You don't have to like sweat and stress and worry about playing the game correctly or not. Anyway, let's go ahead and start the character creation process. I'm going to go ahead and do a female here, just for variety's sake. And it's interesting, in this game, the first thing that you pick is the race. And I find this really bizarre. I think that the first thing you should pick is the class, and then the background, and then pick the race. I feel like picking the race first is a little bit odd, but let's talk things through. So when you pick your race, there's 6 different ones to choose from. And what's odd about this process is that the first thing that you see are like these stat bonuses. So just in case you haven't played the game much or you haven't played it before, these stat bonuses range from very insignificant to literally irrelevant, depending on how you end up arraying your attributes. So I find that kind of puzzling. Maybe even like having to pick your class first, then your background, then your attributes, and then maybe your race would make more sense than picking your race right here, because this is the first thing that new players are going to see, and they think, oh, this must be important. Elves get +1 dexterity, huh? But it's actually sort of unimportant and or trivial. But anyway, I will be playing a Barbarian. So I'm going to be in the front lines doing melee damage, and I'm not going to go through all the different races here, racial options, but I'll go over the ones that make sense for the character that I'm going to play. Because what's actually important is that after you pick a race, you then pick a sub-race, and that matters because the sub-race gives you an ability, and that ability can be, you know, sort of significant. It's something whose impact you'll probably feel throughout the game, or at least it'll be relevant even if you don't necessarily feel it. Now, humans are a bit weird because there's 3 different sub-races, and they all have the exact same ability. So I'll talk about it because this is a choice that's pretty popular for melee characters. I personally don't like it. Basically, once per encounter, after you go below half health, you get a temporary bonus to accuracy and damage. You can look up in the wiki what the exact values are, but basically I hate abilities that rely on me going down below half health, because typically in this game, if you go down below half health, you're fucked. So I don't want to ever do any strategy that relies on that. So basically for me, as far as I'm concerned, being a human is like not having an ability at all. Then there's the Amawa, and these get +2 might, so if you're going to max out might, that's a slight benefit if you want to do as much damage as possible. But then there's also the Island Amawa, which is a sub-race choice that pretty much any class can be. This is a great choice if you want to do a lot of micromanagement and be very active in combat. So in this game, you have 2 weapon sets, and you can switch between them in battle. There is a delay, but you can take a talent that reduces that delay substantially. So what you can do is, with the Island Amawa, you get an additional weapon set, putting your total up to 3. So you can put like a big fat, very slow reload gun in 2 of your weapon sets, and then your normal weapon in your final weapon set. So at the beginning of battle, you fire your gun that has a ridiculously long reload, do a gerbadillion damage, then you switch to your second weapon set, fire that gun, and then finally you switch to your final weapon set with your melee weapon, and you run into melee. So you can do that. I don't like micromanaging that much, so I'm not going to pick this, but this is a very valid choice if you want to play a sort of glass cannon-y type of melee damage dealer. Pretty much anything other than a pure tank. You can even do this for ranged characters and just have an extra gun to fire. It's probably one of the most impactful sub-race abilities in the game. You just have to tolerate some micromanagement. Another option is Dwarf. This is what I'm going to end up picking, so I'll talk about that last. Then we got Elves. So one good choice for really any class is the Pale Elf. They get 10 resistance to burn and freeze damage, which is a pretty significant amount, and burn and freeze come up, relatively often. I mean, obviously elemental damage is never going to be as common as slashing, piercing, and crushing damage, but it comes up often enough, and it's nice to keep you alive, especially because if your strategy is oriented around not getting hit, so like either like a second row melee character or a back row ranged person, the burn and freeze damage type stuff is the stuff that's most likely to end up hitting you because these are going to be the fireballs and whatever that the enemy shoots into your back lines. So Pale Elf's always a decent choice. The Orlan is probably one of the best races in the game. Both of the abilities are just spectacular. So the Hearth Orlan has a really cool ability, which is that when you attack something that another ally is also attacking, 10% of your hits turn into crits. So it's a nice just damage boost, kind of a fire and forget thing. The only thing about this is that you do have to remember to make sure you target enemies that someone else is also targeting. So if you are ever going to play like a lone wolf character that goes off and attacks things by itself, then the Hearth Orlan doesn't work. But if you're just a typical frontliner in the thick of things, this is a great choice. And then the Wild Orlan gets a plus, I believe, 10 bonus to all defenses whenever targeted by a will attack. I think that basically just means you get plus 10 will, but it's even better than that. Like, let's say somebody tries to charm you, you get plus 10 bonus to all your defenses for a short time, and so then that improves your deflection as well. So melee attacks at that point will also have a smaller time of hitting you. So that's also a very decent choice if you're more interested in a defensive orientation. Finally, there are the godlikes. Now, these are pretty cool because there's 4 different ones, and these abilities tend to be stronger than the other races' abilities. One thing that I don't know if it's mentioned here is that godlike can't wear helmets. Now, helms in this game aren't like that amazing. There do start to be some good ones kind of towards the end of the game. So it's not the end of the world to not be able to wear helms, but I like helms, so I'm not going to pick godlike, but that being said, there's some decent choices here. So Moon Godlike is a very fan favorite. Whenever you go below 75%, 50%, and 25% health, you emit this aura of healing. So it's a nice defensive choice, particularly because of 2 reasons. Number 1, it works when you go below 75%, which is way more reasonable than going below 50%. And second of all, this ability actually heals you. So as far as things go that activate only when you go below a certain amount of health, healing is pretty logical. I don't want to get like bonuses to, bonuses to like accuracy and damage that require me to be dying, because if I'm dying, what I need is resistance. So, or like defenses. So that's why Moon Godlike is a good choice. I also like the Fire Godlike, though it doesn't get a whole lot of attention. But these guys, when they go below 50% endurance, they get some damage reduction, which is really, really nice. And they also do a little bit of fire damage to anyone who hits them. If you end up taking the Scion of Flame talent, which causes you to do more damage with your fire attacks, I believe that works with this, which makes it a little bit better. So it's a decent choice. I'm not going to pick it, but it's a decent choice. Now let's go back and talk about dwarves. I think dwarves are one of the most underrated races in the whole game. So admittedly, the mountain dwarves are total garbage. You should never play one unless you want to make the game more challenging for yourself. I literally don't even know what causes poison and disease attacks. Like, I just couldn't tell you where that even happens, and it's not that big of a deal. But the boreal dwarf is fantastic. So they get plus 15 accuracy against wilder and primordial creatures. Now, if you go online on forums, people are like, oh, dwarves, it's only a conditional bonus, it's only against wilders and primordials. But the thing you have to keep in mind is there's only 5 categories of creatures in the game. You got your Kith. Kith are basically the player races. These are all Kith. Then you got your beasts and your undead. Now, other than that, there's only 2 others, and those are wilder and primordial. Plus, wilders and primordials are really, really tough, so getting plus 15 accuracy against them is huge. A good rule of thumb, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but this is what the internet says, so I'm just going to go for it, because combat math in this game is kind of complicated. A good rule of thumb is that plus 5 accuracy is kind of like having an extra 10% chance of hitting. So if your chance of hitting was like, 60%, if you get plus 5 accuracy, it'll be 70%. So that is the approximation that I have been given to understand. So plus 15 means like an extra 30% chance of hitting wilders and primordials, which again is like 40% of the creature types. Now, I'm not saying that 40% of the enemies in the game are wilder and primordials. It's probably less than that, but they're common enough, and they're some of the toughest enemies. So getting that extra 30% to hit is pretty damn sweet. Also, I want to talk a little bit about strategy in this game in general. Accuracy is a really, really valuable stat, because the way that hits work in this game is different from D&D and from the Infinity Engine games that this game is kind of an homage to. In the Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale games and in Dungeons and Dragons, when you roll to attack, you roll a 20-sided die, and if you get a 20, that's a crit. If you get a 1, that's a critical fail. And then somewhere in between, you add your bonuses, and if that meets or exceeds the defense you're trying to hit, then that's a hit. If it does not meet or exceed it, then it is a miss. So there's really only one threshold to cross. That is between missing and hitting. As far as crits are concerned, there's no threshold, because that's just roll a 20, which is the same no matter what. But in this game, it's like a sliding scale. So if you get to your enemy's defense, then that is a hit. But if you exceed it by a certain amount, you get a crit. And then if you're a little bit below, then you get a graze. So a graze is an attack that deals 50% less damage. And a crit is a very accurate attack that ends up dealing 50% more damage. So there's 3 different thresholds. There's the difference between missing and grazing, the difference between grazing and hitting, and the difference between hitting and critting. So whereas in D&D, let's say you get like a +1 to your attack rolls, you're rolling a 20-sided die, so there's a 5% chance on any given roll that what would have been a miss ends up being a hit. But in this game, if you get whatever the equivalent of +1 on a d20 is, there's a 5% chance that what would have been a miss is now going to be a graze, a 5% chance that what would have been a graze is now going to be a hit, and a 5% chance that what would have been a hit is now going to be a crit. So there's 3 times as much value to accuracy in Pillars of Eternity than in typical D&D modeled systems. So getting +15, which is sort of like I said before, that's like a 30%, that's like a 30% chance that what would have been a hit will now be a crit. 30% chance that would have been a graze is now going to be a hit, and a 30% chance that would have been a miss will now be a graze, all against Wilders and Primordials, which are some of the toughest enemies in the game, and that is very, very welcome. So that's why I'm going to pick Dwarf for my character. Now, which class am I going to be? Well, I'm going to be a Barbarian, and the reason for that is very simple. Basically, Barbarians are the last class that you can play as if... I should start that sentence over again. During the game, you encounter companions who join your party. The Barbarian companion is the last one that you find. You don't find a Barbarian companion until the 2nd expansion. So basically, if you don't play as a Barbarian, unless you hire a generic Barbarian at a tavern, you're not going to get to see a Barbarian until the very end. And kind of a more important to me reason anyway is that it'll be longer before you find a companion whose class duplicates the class of your character. Like, if you end up picking a fighter, fighters are a great class, but, the first thing you find is a fighter. So it's a little bit depressing. I mean, obviously, you can take that fighter and kick him out, the NPC one, but it's cool not to run into those duplications. So just for the sake of variety, I'm going to pick a Barbarian. And I happen to think Barbarians are a pretty good class. Now, this is another thing that's a bit underrated in the online community. So there are people online who defend Barbarians, no, Barbarian really is a good class, but that kind of tells you something, because any class that needs defending, clearly that means there's a wide perception that the class is bad. And I guess I'm one of the defenders. I think Barbarians are really terrific. So the thing that makes Barbarians special is that they have this carnage ability. What that means is that when you hit somebody with an attack, you also roll to hit everybody within a certain area of the enemy that you hit. And then if you make that hit roll, you deal about 2/3 damage to that enemy. So it's basically like every single melee hit the Barbarians get also damages every other enemy in an AoE for about 2/3 of your default damage. That's pretty great. Now, online, people are like, oh, well, Barbarians are good when you're fighting against groups of enemies, but then they're bad if it's just against a single big target. And when I read that, I'm just like, hey, have you ever played that game? What's the game called? Yeah, Pillars of Eternity. Have you ever played that game, Pillars of Eternity? Yeah, it's super fun. And remember how in that game, every single fight is against gigantic mobs of enemies? There's never just one big fatty by himself. And on top of that, anytime you do fight something that's just like by itself, then your party just unloads all of its encounter abilities on it, and it goes down faster than a sack of potatoes. So it's really irrelevant how good someone is at like only single target damage. And the Barbarians, like, default values for accuracy and whatever, you know, assuming you take talents for damage, the damage output is, like, totally fine. But then all the hardest fights in the game, where you're mobbed by enemies, it's just so amazing that you're doing 2/3 damage to everything in an area around anybody that you hit. On top of that, Barbarians have ridiculous health and endurance, just absolutely ridiculous. I'm actually going to play with, like, a minimum Constitution value in this character, and it isn't even going to matter, because even bombing out Constitution, I'm still gonna have like way more health and endurance than I could ever use. So that's really nice. And I do recommend whatever you end up playing, these values are worth looking at. And I'd also check out like the wiki for the game so you can see what all the different classes' default values are, because that can be very significant. So for example, if you take a priest and you stat it out and equip a priest to be like a tank, it's not going to be very effective because their accuracy sucks, their deflection sucks, then their health sucks. So they're not going to be a good tank, even if they wear all the same equipment and have all the right stats to be a tank. So it's very important to consider these default values for characters. You know, the fact that the Barbarian has this really, really high health value enables you to take some liberties in stat assignment that you might not be able to do had you been playing as somebody else. Okay, so now there's 3 main different options that you have when you do play a Barbarian, and those are either to dual wield, to wield a 2-handed weapon, or to wield a 2-handed reach weapon. Now in this game, every weapon has a special property, like it's either accurate, or it gives you bonus deflection, or it bypasses damage resistance of the enemy, which I think is very cool. Like, just, it doesn't have to be magical, it's just like by default, you know, all hatchets give +5 deflection, and all spears give +5 accuracy, and whatever. So, if you wield a weapon with reach, then you get to kind of stand behind the front lines, and not be in as much danger. But you got the opportunity cost, basically, of not getting to have, you know, bonus accuracy or bonus damage piercing, or, sorry, bonus armor piercing, etc. So if you play a regular 2-handed weapon without the reach, then you get to have an extra special property that probably increases your damage output. And if you dual wield, then you get maximum attack speed and arguably more overall damage. Plus you get to use 2 different items, so you can potentially get, like, you know, twice the amount of magic bonuses. And do that. Now, personally, I think the difference between dual wielding and just wielding a regular 2-handed weapon are mostly academic. You can just do whichever one you want. People argue on the internet back and forth over what has the higher DPS. I don't know. I don't really care. The math is complicated. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm going to be playing with a reach weapon because I'm going to have a very, very glass cannon-y type of character, although not super glass cannon-y because of this ridiculous default value for endurance and health. But I'm going to be playing with a reach, so I'm going to be standing behind the front lines and whacking enemies. The nice thing about playing with a reach weapon with Barbarians is that it allows you more control over which enemy to target to maximize your use of carnage. And on top of that, it's just damn convenient. In cramped spaces, it's going to be tricky if everybody is like an up-close melee person. They start bumping into each other, it becomes hard to target the enemy you want to target, it just ends up being a clusterfuck. So I always like to have at least one of my frontliners use a reach weapon. Okay, so let's go ahead and pick our first ability. You have 2 different options, and I think one of them is terrible and the other one's good. So Barbaric Yell is the terrible one. You can frighten twice per encounter enemies in an area of effect, which reduces their accuracy by 10. Now that's a pretty nice debuff. It's a pretty nice debuff, but there's a couple of problems with it. Number 1, why debuff things when you can instead kill them? And number 2, plenty of things in the game are immune to being frightened. Now Frenzy, I think, is a great ability. It can only be used once per encounter, but that's kind of a clue. It's better than the thing that can be used twice per encounter, right? If it was worse, they'd let you use it more. This gives you a nice boost to Might, which increases your damage, Constitution, which makes you a bit more survivable, but most importantly, it gives you plus 33% attack speed, which is terrific. So you do this at the start of a fight, you get much faster attack speed, that means more damage, that means more carnage, that just means more things dying faster, and I would way rather have that 100% of the time than this dumb little yell. So we're gonna grab the Frenzy, and now finally we do our attributes, which I really feel like It needs to happen, like, up front. But anyway, here we are. Let's talk about attributes a little bit, because what the game often tells you is recommended is often completely wrong. Like, for example, here it says highly recommended for Barbarian, but not really. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, because all Constitution does is it gives you endurance and health. And I'm not that concerned about it because I'm going to be using a reach weapon and standing behind my frontline fighter, so I'm not going to be like tanking tons of damage. And on top of that, because Barbarians have so much default value for their health and endurance, you get 16 endurance per level up. It's not actually necessary for Constitution to be high. It doesn't increase your damage output or anything, so if you're not dying, Constitution is not actually doing anything for you. So, not saying these stars are always wrong, but definitely, you know, check some guides or use some common sense about what you understand the abilities to be, and make the decisions for yourself, and not necessarily just blindly follow these stars. Okay, let's talk about what we want to do here. Since our main goal is damage, we're definitely going to want to improve Perception, Dexterity, and Might. These are the three abilities that affect your damage output. Might's pretty straightforward. It increases your damage. Dexterity increases how quickly you attack. And then Perception affects your accuracy. And again, accuracy, like I talked about before, is extremely important. So that's pretty much my #1 priority. Not only do I just hate missing in games, like I'd always rather hit more for less damage than like miss a bunch of times, but maybe then every once in a while hit for more damage. It's just a psychological thing for me. So I'm always going to max out Perception if I'm concerned about dealing damage with a character, because these bonuses to accuracy matter a lot given the graze hit crit system. And especially for a Barbarian with Carnage, where you're making lots and lots of attacks against all the enemies in a cluster, having more crits and a higher chance of getting them is significant because you're rolling more attack rolls than your typical class. On top of that, Intellect is pretty important for Barbarians as well, because what Intellect does is it increases area of effect. So it increases how widely, or what the radius is of your Carnage effect. Now, if you wanted to, you could leave this at base, and that would be totally fine. Pillars of Eternity is very flexible in how you arrange stats. You pretty much can't screw it up. You can really this is more like tailoring your experience rather than just like something you necessarily have to do quote unquote correctly to do well. But I do like having Carnage reach a higher area, so I'm going to go ahead and max that out. And along the way, we're going to go ahead and get rid of Resolve. All Resolve really does is improves your deflection, and it's only 1 point of deflection per point of Resolve, so I'm more likely to get hit with my Resolve maxed out or maxed downwards, but I really don't care, because while I am more likely to get hit down here, I'm not going to be that concerned about it, since I'm not going to be tanking enemies by and large. I'll be like behind a couple of frontline fighters, and even if I do take some heat, I've got enough Constitution that I should be able to withstand it while my party, you know, comes in and mops things up. Then we're going to go ahead and try to max out our Might for more damage and Dexterity. Now you'll notice that when you try to max out 4 of your stats, you run out of stat points. Like here, you can see that even though I bottomed out Resolve and Constitution, I'm still a little bit shy. I'm, you know, 4 points, actually 3 points shy, because with a Dwarf getting a penalty to Dexterity, I'm 3 points shy of being able to max this out. So I like to basically siphon off some other stats to make the gap a little bit closer. And the reason for that is very simple. It just opens up more dialogue options. Not necessarily for talking, but for doing things. Like, so Dexterity, there's a couple places in the game where you have a high Dexterity, you can like pickpocket somebody or throw a rock and hit him in the face or whatever. So it's nice to have these high, just so that you can see more of the different options throughout the game. In fact, I think I'm gonna actually pop one off of Might here and put one there into Dexterity. I would like to have them all be at 18. Dwarves get a +1 to Constitution, so if I could knock off one more Constitution and put it into Dexterity or Intellect, I would. That is, I guess, a slight, very, very inconsequential drawback of being a dwarf. But we'll do this, and then after you assign your stats, you pick your background, which I really feel like you should do first. The background determines 2 things. Number 1, it gives you 1 more stat point, and number 2 determines what weapon you start with. So like you can see, Aether gets +1 Resolve, and it's these dual-wielding weapons, whereas the Deadfire Archipelago gives you Dexterity, and it seems to be a great sword. Now, weapons cost 75 copper, which is not that much. I mean, in the beginning of the game, it's a lot, but by the end, it's nothing. So this is really just a matter of convenience, what your starting weapon is. That being said, if you can pick a stat that you actually like and have a weapon that you're going to use, if you can get both of those birds with the same stone, then there's no reason not to. So I think there's someone here who gets a spear, is there not? Yeah, these guys get a spear, which is a reach or a pike, which is a reach weapon, and that's +1 perception. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, now that I've picked this background, take that off of perception and put that into intellect. That way I've maxed out all 4 of these stats. The might, perception, and intellect. Dexterity is at 17 because I'm a dwarf, but, you know, it's close to maxed out, so it should be good enough. And you do you don't get to increase these stats during the game. You don't get like permanent points to put in, but there are items that increase your stats. So hopefully if there's ever like a challenge that requires a dexterity 18, hopefully I will have gotten +1 dexterity from some source or other that will allow me to make that, you know, dialogue check when I come across it. I haven't remembered and mastered where all the dialogue checks are, but it would be annoying if there was some dexterity 18 requirement and I'm at 17. But anyway, this maxes out as many things as possible to increase my odds of making all those special dialogue checks, and it's, you know, pretty good. So I am ready to click next, and again, and now it's time to pick a background. This is one of those things that is deceptively important. It's like right here at the end, it's like, oh, you know, lore +2 or stealth mechanics +1, like, oh, these little +1, who even gives a shit? But it's actually kind of a big deal, and I want to explain why. There's 5 different skills in the game, and whenever you level up, you get 6 points to assign to the skills. The catch being that the first time you assign points to a skill, it costs 1 point. And then your second time assigning points to a skill, it costs 2 points. And the third time it costs 3 points, etc. Now let's say that you want to get your mechanics up to 10. Well, that's going to cost 1 + 2 + 3 + 4, +9 + 10 skill points, which is 55 skill points. Now, to get 55 skill points, you're going to have to level up 10 times, which means that you will be at level 11 by the time that you get your mechanics up to level 10. Now, if you, let's say, play a class that starts with a +1 mechanics, and then you also pick a background that gives you +1 mechanics, now you're starting at now your mechanics default is 2. So the first time that you put skill points into mechanics, it only costs 1 point, and you go from 2 to 3. Then the next time it's going to cost 2 points, and you go from 3 to 4, etc. So you only have to put points into it 8 times if you're starting at 2 before you're at 10. And so that's actually going to cost 19 fewer skill points. That's only going to cost you, I think, 46 skill points to do, and that will happen after you level up only 8 times. So you'll be at level 9 instead of level 11 when you reach your target. So when you pick these backgrounds, you really want to think about what skill you ultimately want to get very high in, and make sure that you boost that, because there is a big difference between starting with a +1 stealth versus putting a point into stealth later on. Now, my thing is that there should definitely be someone in the party who can do mechanics, and you can have that be your PC just to keep things simple. That way, if, like, let's say, you know, you have your wizard be the person who does mechanics, if the wizard gets called away on some quest, which sometimes happens, then you lose your mechanics person while the wizard's off doing the quest, which can be annoying. But if the person with mechanics is your PC, then you just always have that. And playing without mechanics is possible, but it's very annoying. You end up running into tons of traps, you miss out on some treasure, you miss out on some secret passages. You know, why not have that if all you have to do to get it is have someone in your party with mechanics? Now, the other main option for your main character is lore, because lore opens up dialogue options. So in this case, I am going to try to have my cake and eat it. We're going to be a dwarven barbarian aristocrat, which makes about 0 sense. We could also be a mystic. Okay, I'll be a mystic. I think that makes slightly more sense. I guess we can say that that makes slightly less sense. Yeah, that's probably how I would describe it, to be a mystic instead of an aristocrat barbarian. But anyway, that gives me +2 to lore, so my lore starts out at 2. Barbarians unfortunately don't get a lore bonus to start, but you know, I think you need to get up to like level 10 in lore to have most of the dialogue options open. I haven't checked, I'm not 100% sure, but I'll shoot for getting it up to 10, just so we can see those special dialogue options, and sometimes it's more convenient to beat quests with it, etc. Lore is also used for scrolls. To cast a scroll of a certain level, you have to have at least twice as much lore, but I'm not going to use scrolls because I just hate scrolls. I hate dealing with consumables, so that will not be relevant. This is purely for dialogue options. If you don't care about scrolls and you don't care about bonus dialogue options, then I really would recommend just giving your PC a mechanics bonus. Unfortunately, there's nothing that gives a mechanics +2, but I'd give your PC a mechanics +1 just to, you know, have that be just that much higher. Okay, we are done here. Let's go ahead and stick with the default portrait. And we got to pick a voice here. Well, we did pick a mystic, so whatever that is, I guess we'll do that. Can I hear it? I don't know. Maybe you can hear it and I can't. Maybe I have my volume down too low. But anyway, that'll be our voice. And we got to pick a name here for our character. So let's see. We got a dwarven, barbarian, mystic lady. How about Thogalina? Yeah, that seems good. Okay, perfect. Well, folks, that'll do it for now. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like and/or subscribe, and I'll see you soon when we actually start playing the game.